History of English Literature, Romantic Age, 1798 to 1832, Part B, Episode 1, Short Questions with Answers. Question 1. How did the historical events of French Revolution affect the Romantic poets? Answer. Two major events took place during the wake of the Romantic Age: the Declaration of American Independence in 1776 and the French Revolution. The historical background of Romantic Age mostly records the events of French Revolution. The close of the 7th century saw England and France engage in open warfare in 1793. Many causes contributed to set the war in motion. Hostiles dragged on till 1815, in the end bringing about the extinction of French Republic, the birth of which was greeted by the English liberals. The rise and the destruction of the power of Napoleon Bonaparte and the restoration of dynasty. These events had their effect on every corner of Europe and in none more strongly than in England. The reaction of the French Revolution has been well described. At the beginning of every revolution, men hope for, they think of all that mankind may gain in a new world. In its next phase, they fear, for they think of what mankind may lose. The elder writers of this period, Wordsworth, Coleridge, hailed the new era with joy. However, as the revolution proceeded to unexpected development, there came in turn disappointment, disillusion, dejection, and despair. On the other hand, the younger writers such as Leigh Hunt, Shelley, Keats adhered to the revolutionary doctrines. The French Revolution brought about change in social conditions. The conclusion of the long war brought misery, low wages, unemployment, and heavy taxation on the part of the people. Men like Shelley, Byron called aloud for social justice. The interest in social condition became intensified towards the end of the 19th century until it has grown to be one of the chief features of modern literature. The French Revolution has produced great philosophers like Godwin and Rousseau, who wrote about the restoration of social justice. The slogan of the French Revolution, equality, liberty, and fraternity or death, influenced the mind of Europe. This is the spirit of the revolution which is also reflected in the literature of the age. Like Godwin and Rousseau, Shelley professed for universal brotherhood. He wants a society free from prejudices, or where one is really free, where one embraces another as an equal, neither as inferior nor as superior. The authors and philosophers of this period identify church and monarch as social institutions to be the roots of all social evils. They uphold tyranny and advocated democracy for the betterment of mankind. In fact, the democratic spirit, which is an obvious legacy of French Revolution, is reflected in the works of the great Romantic poets who posed humanitarianism, universal brotherhood in their works. In fact, Romanticism itself owes much to the French Revolution for its humanitarian zeal and revolutionary spirit. Question 2. What do you know about Romanticism or Romantic movement? Answer. The Romantic movement is a revolt against the new classical school of 18th century and a return to the literary ideals of Elizabethans. This movement makes a distinction between classicism and romanticism. The significant impulses of this movement are freedom of imagination, passion for nature, and longing for the past, which opposes reason, logic, restraint, order, balance, and regulation of classicism. The Romantic movement began at the end of 18th century and at the beginning of the 19th century. It was a deliberate revolt against the literary principles of the age of reason. Just as Dryden and Pope rejected the Romantic tradition of Elizabethans and followed classical and French new classical masters. Similarly, Wordsworth and his followers rejected the new classical principle in favor of Romantic ideals. In a sense, the 19th century Romantic poets were reverting to the Elizabethan or to the first Romantic age in English literature. However, 19th century Romantic poets are different from the Elizabethan in their attitude to external nature. Wordsworth and his followers in the 19th century appealed with a freedom of imagination and passionate attitude towards nature. In fact, the publication of lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1798 officially announces the beginning of Romantic movement. Lyrical ballads is a monumental document of Romantic movement. The poets who followed Wordsworth's lead in the Romantic movement are Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, and Byron, but each of them was individual in dealing with their theme and subject. The lyrical ballads opens with Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner and closes with Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. The poems published in the lyrical ballads are new in theme and style. Moreover, Wordsworth in the preface of the lyrical ballads explains that the principal objects of Romantic poetry was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate them in a selection of language really used by men, and at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination. Thus, ordinary things would appear extraordinary and unusual. It is to be noted that the success of French Revolution, the prolonged struggle of England and Europe against Napoleon, influenced the new band of poets, and they advocated liberalism and democracy. As a result, in the works of the Romantic poets, we notice love for ordinary aspects of life and for humanity in general. The Romantic movement brought about a change in the taste of public regarding poets and poetry. Romantic poets took poetry to the doorstep of common man. Question 3. Why is Blake called the precursor of Romantic poetry? Answer. William Blake is regarded as the precursor of Romantic poetry. He belongs to the age of transition from late 18th century to early 19th century poetry. Some of his poems are like the poets of 18th century poets because they give us a picture of life and society. His another group of poets give us the impression of English Romantic poetry because they are imaginative, sensuous, and simple like the Romantic poets. He writes about the beauty of nature, hills, sea, birds, trees, forests, etc., which became the subject matter of Romantic poets. Before the arrival of the Romantic poets, he wrote Romantic poetry. Therefore, he can be called the precursor of Romantic poetry. It seems that Romantic poets followed the style of Blake and gave a full expression to Blake's Romanticism. Blake's poems were published into two collections, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. Songs of Innocence are poems about the innocence state of mind, the beauty, the simplicity of life. These poems show love for nature, beauty, imagination, etc., which were the favorite subject matter of the Romantic poets. The Romantic poets were inspired by Blake. It seems that they got a ready-made form of poetry from Blake. If he born later, he would have been grouped with the Romantic poets. Question 4. Is Romanticism a revival or a revolt? Answer. English Romantic movement was both a revival and a revolt. It was a revival of Elizabethan romance, imagination, love for nature and the beauty, and it was a revolt against the classicism or new classicism of the 18th century. The Romanticism of the 19th century revived the spirit of Elizabethan Renaissance, like love for nature, beauty, medieval romance, supernaturalism, freedom, subjectivity, etc. All the romantic parts and strangeness to beauty. I repeat it. All the romantic poets add strangeness to beauty. They present ordinary things to be extraordinary, unusual things to be usual things to be unusual. Throwing the coloring of imagination, they take the readers into a strange land, far from the world of reality. The Romantic movement is also a revolt because Romantic poets reacted against the style of the 18th century poets. The 18th century poets used simile, metaphor, allusion, and other poetic dictions like heroic couplets in their poetry. As a result, their poetry was artificial, witty, and intellectual for their understanding of common people. Their poetry was criticism of life and society. On the other hand, Romantic poets believed the language of poetry should be simple, so that common people may be understood and get pleasure. Poets must not use poetic dictions. The 19th century Romantic poets revolted against the 18th century poets and used simple language and language of the common man to be language of poetry. In fact, Romanticism is a new poetic movement of the 19th century. It is a movement of freedom and imagination, love for nature and beauty. The 18th century poets wrote about upper class society, fashionable life, artistic drawing room, but Wordsworth and his followers wrote about common people and ordinary objects of nature. Therefore, to the 18th century poets, nature means human nature, the feeling of sorrows and sufferings. But to the Romantic poets, nature means the world of leaves, trees, flowers, seas, hills, forests, etc. Question 5. Write a short note on Wordsworth's pantheism or Wordsworth's philosophy of nature. Pantheism is a philosophical doctrine which means God lives in nature or nature is God. Wordsworth's nature philosophy has something common with pantheistic philosophy. Wordsworth in his poems dealt with his personal experiences in nature, and his experience in nature shows his spiritual attitude to nature. Wordsworth not only describes the beauty and charms of nature, but also the divine mood he found in nature. His attitude to nature is different from other parts of nature because he found a spirit in the body of nature. Wordsworth says, I felt a presence, a sense of sublime dwelling in the setting sun, a living air, blue sky, and in the mind of man. These lines from the Tintin Abbey explains Wordsworth's philosophy that God pervades in all objects of nature and in the heart of man. Wordsworth's love for nature is intimate and spiritual. He is called a pantheist because he discovers the presence of God in nature. He believes nature is as living as human being. This idea is pantheistic indeed. Question 6. Write a short note on the prelude. Answer. The prelude is the most important autobiographical poem of Wordsworth. It records the earliest experiences of his childhood life. He recalls the river Derwent and calls it the fairest of all rivers. He remembers the murmuring, the sound of the river like the music of songs. The sound of the river gave him the philosophical thought. He describes the incidents of childhood life like trapping bird, stealing woodcocks, robbing birds' eggs, stealing boats for rowing, etc. These incidents produce the feeling of joy and fears. Wordsworth learns a philosophy of life and nature from his experience of nature. These incidents have become parts of his life. Wordsworth realizes that fear is necessary to teach morality, goodness, and virtue. Nature taught him to be a good man. Therefore, his autobiographical the prelude is important to understand Wordsworth's nature philosophy. The incidents of childhood life have become a part of his memory and influenced his thinking and conduct. Question 7. Write a short note on lyrical ballad. Answer. The publication of lyrical ballad in 1798 announces the beginning of Romantic poetry. It closes the 18th century poetry and announces a new kind of poetry, Romantic poetry. The Romantic poetry was poetry about nature. Wordsworth adds a preface to the lyrical ballads and explains the theme and subject matter and style of Romantic poetry. He explains how Romantic poetry is different from the traditional 18th century poetry. Wordsworth also explains the aiming and purpose of Romantic poetry. He says, the language of poetry should be the language of common men, so that readers must understand poetry in order to get pleasure. Therefore, in the preface, Wordsworth says Romantic poetry is new in theme and style. Romantic poets write about ordinary objects of nature, ordinary man and woman, but they present them to be extraordinary, throwing a color of imagination on them. In other words, Romantic poetry is poetry of imaginative sensibility and intimate love for nature. Therefore, the preface helps us to understand Romantic poetry. The preface popularized Romantic poetry. Thank you, viewers.